If you haven't seen Hans's boots, please take a look at it. They are the Who boots. So if you are not a fan of the Who, please stay away. Like I said, my name is Chris Anderson. I'm with the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission out of Florida. This is definitely a difference from where I'm used to, where it's been 80 degrees and now we're expecting a tropical storm tomorrow. So just as I go in through here, we're going to talk about environmental sensitivity index maps in Florida. I'm going to scream through this just because I can spend probably hours talking about this. Just a little bit of background. My agency is actually responsible by law within the state of Florida to provide mapping support in case there's an oil spill anywhere within state waters. So during Deepwater Horizon, we had staff that were in 3 different command centers in Houma, Louisiana, Mobile, Alabama, and St. Petersburg, and then Miami, Florida. So this is all oil spill related, but it can be for any other disaster as it relates for there. So I'll just go through ESI just real quick, but I'll get into it a little bit deeper. Within Florida, ESI is available going all the way back to 1981. We have some of the original atlases as it relates to it. And because Florida has, depending upon scale, up to 7,000 miles of shoreline, we've actually had to break it out into several different regions, even going into a couple of the rivers of the St. Johns and the Apalachicola. So as you can see, the dates next to there is the dates of the last time an atlas was produced. And 2012 is in highlight because I'm going to be talking about that in just a second. The next one is ACP, or Area Contingency Plans. So the state waters of Florida is actually covered by 2 U.S. Coast Guard divisions and 5 sector commands. So each sector is responsible for developing its own area contingency plan. And each of those, area committees is represented by a Coast Guard, a state agency, some federal agencies, responsible parties, etc. So they are there and going through and trying to find all the information and compiling it such that it would be needed in the case of a spill. So it's usually starting within the first, let's say, 24 to 48 hours, and then some additional information that would take you a little bit longer past that. At the time, when I first started there and started working on parts of these projects, 2 of the captain of the ports, only Tampa and Jacksonville, had any maps. And I say that this is created by a bunch of guys just sitting in a room. I should add it's probably at night with a bunch of beer and maybe some other stuff. So the maps were just all over the board. They were just putting on things into it. It was a mess. So, and the one thing that they had on there was what we call I'm going to call variable grids with little or no, with just a little overlap. So needless to say, they weren't cartographers. They were just folks that do responding and just knew the information, and they were just making things up as they were going along. Going into the late 90s, we did what we called GIS-ified, the captain of the port maps for Tampa. So in this case, for us as GIS sides, we look at data that has any sort of spatial reasoning to it, and we basically say we can make a map, let's put it into our system, and therefore we can use it, which is completely different than anybody had thought about it sort of within Florida at the time. So we did our first round of it, and then multiple contracts later with the U.S. Coast Guard. We did it with Districts 7 and 8. So we actually covered all of the ACP maps, or the GRP, what they call GRP maps, for all of Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, and the Puerto Rico U.S. Virgin Islands. That is, and each sector probably had about 60 to 70 maps. So this was a major task to create the GRPs. And one of the big decisions that we made at the time, because ESIs are quad-based, they're based upon USGS quads, that we would mirror that so that all of the GRP maps that we would do would be based upon that same quads. So you're going to ask what ESI is. Basically, ESI is composed of two parts. It includes a biology section and a socioeconomic section. So we have a shoreline sensitivity to oil from 1 to 10. We have species distribution, which includes both the physical, so that is doing like a bird nest, a bird colony, or a spatial distribution of a species based upon concentration. Or then we also have a whole table in the background which includes a whole bunch of information associated with it. And then on the socioeconomic side, it's all the things that, like I said, boat ramps, marinas, beach access, et cetera. Within the contingency plan maps, we think of these more as tactical data. So this is going to be your booms, your booming strategies, et cetera, et cetera. So these are going to be the things that you're going to pull out within the first 24 hours. How can we get our first crack at doing any oil spill response, and then starting to get into planning a little bit later. So I'll go to this one here. Forgive the cartography, it's not mine. On the left, you can see that's an ESI map. That's from the Fort DeSoto area in 1996. And then that's the ACP map corresponding to it that we made probably, I think it's probably the late 2000s. So as you can see, there's a lot of information here that are important to responders. And what we'll do going into a spill is we'll actually print both copies of these out at much larger sized, E-size, or even bigger if we can get it, and just put these up on a wall. And what you'll have is these now become almost like a briefing map, and you have everything from the incident commanders all the way down to like logistics and smaller folks looking in there to see where things are, where they need to plan, et cetera, et cetera. So you may be pasting 3 or 4 of these at one time for ESI and then go to ACPs. So these actually become a pretty important thing so that you can, if you find one feature on one side or a point, such as in our case shell key, middle left-hand side, you can find shell key corresponding on the right-hand side. Now, NOAA decided to get smart and do a little bit more automated side, and in 2012, they decided to look into redesigning the ESI maps. So, whereas before when we're doing USGS quads, it's a regular tiling scheme, they did a variable one, and then they also started changing the symbology. So this is the panhandle of Florida. So you can see it's the regular USGS quad grid, and now they're coming into here, and they're now starting to do overlapping. So it's very arbitrary rather than being very consistent. So the numbers start getting a little bit off, and it gets a little bit harder looking from map to map. Now I'm going to jump to 2015, where this really comes into play, where NOAA really formalized their new design for their ESI maps. They used I'm going to call a sliding grid, which I'll show you in a minute. They changed it to more of a Mercator projection. They did it as a portrait, and they did maps at multiple scales based upon content. So now I'll show you the one on the left-hand side is the old ESI quad grid, or the ESI index grid prior to 2015, and the one to the right is the new one from NOAA. So they changed the scale, and like I said, they changed the number of maps. So you can see there's a slight difference there. Now what they did also then was they broke it apart, and they sort of made little mini quarter quads within there. So you can see some of them are not exactly, they're off a little bit. So this would be the new tiling scheme that now NOAA's going through for the entire east coast of Florida. So they've done like New York, South Carolina, Georgia with this. So all of a sudden for us, we're starting to look and getting shocked at this. Let me see. One of the things with there is, like I said, with the multiple scales, the socioeconomics, they left at the 1 to 100,000 scale, and then the biological they did at the 1 to 50. So those are going to be at the quarter quads. So the idea is there's not going to be as much information on the socioeconomic as there is in the biological, so they tried to flip it out there. So what we'll do here is this is one of the ESIs from prior to 2015, and then they're going to move it into something like this, which is the 1 to 100K. And then these are the biologicals. Now the problem here is you're going to come to see is the biology can get very, very, very complicated. So that's the reason why they went with the quarter quads. But you can see the differences in the way that NOAA is moving. So within Florida, our data were updated early in the 2010s, but we hadn't done any of the atlases since '96, primarily because it's very expensive. We would be contracting with somebody to do all the mapping. So it was one of those trying to find funding. We're always trying to find funding to do this. So NOAA came to us, and they were willing to pay for all the atlas production if we were willing to do their tiling scheme. So, and one of the problems we had with that is our beaches on the Panhandle are east-west oriented rather than north-south on the East Coast. So we had an internal debate of, do we stay with the new tiling scheme, or do we stay with the old tiling scheme of the USGS quads, or do we go with the new atlases and get them paid for? But our problem is, as you probably saw, is that our GRP maps that we had made, which were based upon the old tiles, would not match the new ones. So for us, this is one of those where now you couldn't put the maps up on the wall and have a one-to-one correlation between the two. We did go through and we did start talking to a lot of responders and the Coast Guard. They do not like this. They like it the way that it was before. So, and for us, we have a lot of data that are coded within the GRPs and the ESIs for the corresponding ESI map number. So we would have to go through and completely change everything in our data. So for us, we have existing DVDs that we've passed out to the Coast Guard so that they can use without connecting to anything. So our internal debate continued, sort of, do we want to save money by having NOAA do the maps and live with the new tiling scheme, or are the differences and the disruption worth the savings? So our solution is that we would save the money by doing the maps ourselves. So Research Planning Incorporated, which is the group that does a lot of the mapping and creates the atlases for the ESI, we contracted with them to get their custom ESI tool that allows us to use map templates, but we're able to symbolize ESI correctly based upon all of the tables and underneath. But then we can also do custom maps or bulk maps depending upon a grid size. So this will allow us to go in and do all of that ourselves. And then we can export all the ESI atlases, and then there's extra tables that are in the background which show distributions of species and things like that. So one of the things that we ended up with is that we are going to adopt a two-map strategy for each grid, where one is going to be socioeconomic and one is going to be biological. So we're still working with that to try and reduce the number of maps. And then if we get into an area where it's super complicated, we might flip into a quarter quad to highlight just that area. So we feel that that's kind of a decision that we made. It's actually a big one. I sat in the head of our group, who is our state scientific support coordinator, who's one of the ones running it, and I argued for this the best as possible because I felt it was necessary to have the two quads and the two map sets that were together. So I know Hans is going to put the 2-minute up in just a second. So what I'll do is, rather than go into a lot of the details with we do have ESI has at this address, you can get any of the ESI maps for any state, any coastal state, and I think they even have Guam in there. So any of the ESI maps that are made around and data, and all the old atlases are available there. We do have all of our ACP maps or GRP maps that are available on there as well. And then we also have our the area contingency plans within there. So if any of you are interested in any sort of what we're doing within the state of Florida and all of ours, these are the places to go. So we've actually had, I'll just say, under 20 years of experience putting all of this digitally. So it's actually a pretty big project that we've done through the last probably about 10 or 15 years consistently. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me, catch me a little bit later. I can go into way more detail about ESI, way more detail about GRP maps and how they're used in an oil spill situation, because I could probably do this for about 3 or 4 hours. So anyway, I guess last one, I think the banquet's coming up in about, an hour? Something like that. So, all right, thank you very much. I greatly appreciate it.